Hello and welcome to another session of Frank Talk events, which BME Network organizes this series of talks on different issues every 2 weeks to provide clarity on different issues kidney disease and transplant patients might have. We are a small charity based in Manchester, and we provide advice, support, and advocacy and education to kidney disease and transplant patients and their families who find it difficult navigating government systems and institutions. The areas we provide advice and support are in housing, benefits applications and appeals, hospital appointments and meetings, employment processes and workplace procedures. We also campaign and raise awareness about organ and blood donation. These are especially important to us because of the number of people from the Black community on the list hoping for a second chance at life. I was given a second chance by a mother who lost her child. And this is why I do what I do. At the end of this session, I have exciting news I'm sure everybody who is here today will surely want to get involved in. So moving on to why we're here today, we have the honor to introduce Dr. Rachel Middleton. She is a consultant in kidney medicine at Salford Royal Foundation Trust and has been a consultant since 2006. She has clinical responsibility for hemodialysis at the Bolton Kidney Care Centre. She's an honorary lecturer at the University of Manchester, and her research interests include examining risk factors that cause worsening of chronic kidney disease. She founded the Chronic Renal Insufficiency Standards Implementation Study in 2002, a forerunner to the current Salford Kidney Study. She will clarify issues around safely returning to our normal routine, especially for renal and transplant patients. It has been an issue for most of us who have been shielding and many others. The conflicting messages we receive from the government and other cares have confused some people. I hope by the end of this session, it will allay some of our fears. Thank you for listening to me. I'll hand over to Theo now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. So today we are delighted and pleased to have Dr. Middleton, who is going to address certain issues about how you can safely exit lockdown, especially for those who have been part of the UK government shielded patient program. As you've heard, Dr. Middleton is a consultant in renal medicine, and she has a wealth of experience on all things relating to kidney disease. And I know that she has been especially challenged over the last 12 months or so with looking after this very vulnerable set of patients who have weakened immunity, perhaps have had a transplant. And if you add on to that ethnicity, which is what Hilary's charity supports, you have a very vulnerable group of people. And shielding was started, shielding was paused, and then shielding was restarted, and now I think it's finally over. But as we start going back towards normality and we start thinking about going to work, maybe even going to foreign travel, some anxieties and perhaps some access to decent information is what is required. So I will hand over to Dr. Middleton to talk to us and share her thoughts. And as it goes on, please use the chat box to put in any questions, which I will put to Dr. Middleton at the end of her talk. Or you can use the raise hand function, and we can bring you into the studio. Rachel, thank you very much.
No problem. Many thanks for the invite. I'm really delighted to be able to talk to you and share some of my thoughts. Some of this will be data that I'm presenting, but certainly some is my own opinion based on my reading of the literature, my reading of the news, as it's been a unique time with evolving information over the last year, and some of the data I'm presenting has only just come out in the last week. I'm going to try and share my screen. Hopefully it will work. Apologies if not, do let me know. But hopefully you can see this. So the title of my talk is Coming Out of Lockdown Safely. I'm going to just go over some of the things that we've learned over the last year, because this time last year was a very scary time for so many of you. And congratulations for coping and for learning all these new words that have become part of our everyday vocabulary. Who would have thought that we'd be talking about mutations and R numbers and mRNA as we do now? And so what I will cover is what we know now that we didn't know a year ago. Something about shielding and some local data, why shielding was required, when it's useful. I'll cover vaccination and then some tips for getting back to normality. So what do we know about COVID-19 a year on? Well, we've got a good understanding now of how COVID-19 is transmitted. If we take our minds back a year ago, we really didn't know. We didn't know, should we be cleaning our mail when it comes through? Can we pass people in the street? What can we do if we think we've got COVID? A year ago, there wasn't the access to testing that there is now. So let's try and make a bit more sense of that and how we can reduce our risk. So how is COVID transmitted? You know that it's droplet transmitted, and we knew that from quite early on. So liquid particles that when infected, people cough, sneeze, speak, sing, can be within 1 meter to 2 meters locality and have direct access via your eyes, nose and mouth, which is where the familiar hands, face space came from. But actually only in this last week have the WHO confirmed that there is airborne spread of COVID as well. So these are really tiny particles that linger in the air, so suspended there. And so at a greater distance, if you're in poorly ventilated rooms for longer periods, this can be a risk of contracting COVID. And this has likely been responsible for some of the super spreader events that we've had over the last year. So remember then, well ventilated spaces for shorter periods of time are important, as well as hands, face space. So if you think you've got COVID symptoms, and you know most of those by now, but I would just say gastrointestinal upset we seem to see more of in the transplant population. So a fever with diarrhea and vomiting would also prompt a reason to get a test, as well as those classical symptoms of temperature, cough and loss of smell and taste. It's easy to get a test now, thankfully. And do contact your healthcare team if you are testing, and particularly if you test positive, as they may recommend changes to your medication over the course of your illness. One thing that I just wanted to mention, which I don't think is widely advertised and certainly is available in the northwest of England, is something called oximetry at home. So as someone clinically extremely vulnerable, you would all be qualify for oximetry at home if you tested positive for COVID. And this is where you'll be equipped with an oxygen saturation monitor and be asked to check this at certain times of the day, usually after a little exercise. And you would have regular phone calls with an expert team who would check your oxygen saturations and advise if anything different needed to be done for your healthcare. And that support is there for 2 weeks. At the moment, the way to access that is through your GP practice rather than through your transplant team. But again, I would urge, if you have any concerns, do call 111 or attend the emergency department. And we do have other treatments now that we didn't have a year ago. So dexamethasone has shown to significantly reduce mortality. Tocilizumab also an impact on mortality if you're critically ill, and vaccination obviously as well, if people did still contract COVID, causes less severe illness. Just briefly then, in the dark blue is the standard PCR test. And now just to mention about lateral flow tests. So these are widespread now. I think most people can obtain them. And again, a way to help keep you safe is for people around you, people who you're in frequent contact with, to undertake rapid lateral flow tests. to ensure that they're negative. Obviously, if you have symptoms, then you do need to do a PCR test as well. But lateral flows definitely, I do believe, have a role. So why should we shield? Well, as you know, immunosuppressive medicines reduce your body's antiviral response, making you more vulnerable to any infections. And that is why you've needed to be asked to shield for COVID-19. And so it increases your risk of getting severe illness. And with kidney disease, people often are of more older age, diabetes, heart disease, ethnicity, which all adds to your risk. And shielding is a very important non-pharmacological way of minimising your risk, avoiding droplet and airborne infection when community cases are particularly high. And as you know, shielding stopped on the 31st of March, and I hope that that will remain, but it's so very difficult to predict right now. So does shielding make a difference? I'm going to show you some data from Salford. So these are the cases in our transplant population of COVID-19 diagnosed by PCR over a 13-month period. And I've just highlighted in orange the periods when we had to shield. You can see in that first few months, when things were so very difficult, actually, we didn't see many cases of COVID. And I think that was particularly because so many people were shielding around that time. The furlough protection was there financially. And also the cases in the Northwest were not as great as the rest of the UK. You can see in period 3 of shielding how the cases reduced during that shielding time. So I'm very much convinced that shielding does work. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is October and November, and particularly October was our peak month for cases. And actually, if you look at the local prevalence of COVID-19, it was particularly high during this time. So the call for shielding came quite late, I believe, at this time, and hence the number of cases. So in October, the number of cases in Manchester was 550 per 100,000. So a very high level. And sorry, I'll just go back there. This is the graph of the cases in Manchester. So if you look at the UK as a whole, you'll get a very different opinion and picture. And people talk about this being the second wave. But actually in the Northwest, this was our second wave in September to December. And makes me feel that when cases are on the rise, when the R number is increasing, we should, where possible, shield or restrict our activities to help keep us safe. So does shielding make a difference? Yes, I do believe it does. And what I do think is important is looking at local data, and that's more relevant to you than national data. And then now, again, a year on, that data is freely available on a number of websites. You can put your postcode in and see what's happening locally to understand, is it safe for you to start going out more and more, or should you be pulling back a little bit? So moving on to talk about vaccination, focusing really on the UK, but acknowledging this is an international issue. So how do vaccines work? They're there to train your immune system to activate your immune response. So the B cells that will be produced that make antibodies to stop the virus getting into your cells, and T cells help stimulate those B cells and kill any infected cells. And an important thing about vaccines is it provides an immune memory, so that if ever you're exposed to the virus in months' time, it can trigger this response to help protect you from COVID. The current vaccines in use, as you know, we've got mRNA vaccines, so the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine just produces mRNA into the cells of the virus. Adenovirus vectors use a different virus to bring a deactivated part of the spike into the body. And then the Novavax vaccine, which will be coming later this year, just uses a part of the spike protein to stimulate your immune response. And whilst I'm talking about vaccines, I just want to highlight why it's so important to have 2 vaccine doses. So the first vaccine dose will stimulate a primary immune response, so the first peak here, which will diminish over time and potentially quite quickly. And so a second dose is needed to really heighten and give a boost to the immune system, and provide that immune memory and hopefully keep that antibody response for longer. So if you haven't already, do have your second dose of vaccine. It's very important. So if you've been vaccinated, should you still wear a mask? And I believe, yes, you should, to help protect other people. There is a risk still of asymptomatic spread once you've been vaccinated. And so particularly your family members around you should still take those precautions rather than, oh, it's okay, I'm vaccinated. People could still have a milder form of COVID. Now, the studies are quite reassuring that actually this is quite few people, but do be aware that that certainly still is a possibility. This is a really important question. How effective is the vaccine for people taking immunosuppression? And honestly, as we embarked on vaccinating our transplant population from December, January time, we didn't know the answer to this question, but we're starting to get more and more information, which is perhaps a little bit more reassuring than I thought it was going to be. So this is a study that was first published at the end of March, and it's American data looking at antibodies after their first vaccine dose. The population is quite similar to ours. And the population they took was people who hadn't knowingly had COVID diagnosed by PCR. And the average age of this population was 56, similar to ours. But most people had either the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine in a fairly 50-50 split. And the immunosuppression people were taking was very similar to our population. So the majority on tacrolimus and a good proportion on mycophenolate, as well as half being on steroids. And they found actually after the first dose of vaccine that only 17% had antibodies at 20 days, which obviously was a concern. However, just this week, they've published their data after the second dose of vaccine, and they found more antibody response. So 54% of the population have antibodies checked 29 days after their second dose of vaccine. And this is now on 658 transplant patients, which it isn't as much as the general population studies, but that's over half. So 300 plus patients who now have antibodies that wouldn't have had it without vaccination. So they're protected. The antibodies increase after the second dose again. So remember that graph I showed you that you get a surge after the second dose. So this study was really confirming that antibodies do improve after the second dose. People who had antibodies with the first dose, their antibody levels improved the most with their second dose. But as a general rule, the level of antibody wasn't as much as a general population. people who come to the Salford unit may know that we've been checking antibody data ourselves. We checked antibodies in people in December to February, in people before they were vaccinated, and we're starting to check antibodies in people after they've been vaccinated. And really our data is quite similar to the American data. So we did check antibodies in nearly 300 patients before they had the vaccine. And what we found, which was interesting, is that 55 of these, so 18%, had antibodies to COVID already. And what was really interesting is that 33 of these patients had no idea that they'd had COVID. And some of them are my patients, and I've spoke to them about it and don't have any recollection at all of having COVID. They're often people with a number of family members, children in nurseries. But actually, this was quite reassuring to me that although people with transplants are at higher risk, there's still a number of people who are just having asymptomatic infection and no knowledge that they've had it at all. So there we see of those who had antibodies, more than half didn't know they had COVID at all. And we've looked at antibodies after the first dose of vaccination, and we found about 20% had developed antibodies. This is just in small numbers, so I think it was a total of 76 patients or 74 patients, and about 20%, 21% had developed antibodies after that first dose. And we're continuing to monitor this, and hopefully we'll get some good information going forward to advise on how confident we are that the vaccine is being protective, and when further doses of boosters will be needed, and will that be different to the general population. We've done data, and I've not shown the slide here, but we asked our dialysis population who we vaccinated how they felt about the vaccine, how they tolerated it, and it was an overwhelmingly positive, very little side effects. And I just want to point out at this stage, because the vaccine may not be 100% protective in the transplant population, it is really vital that people around you are vaccinated, who are much more likely to mount a good immune response. And I don't think there's a big fanfare about it, but at the end of March, the government allowed priority vaccination for household members of people who are clinically extremely vulnerable. Obviously, this will be for age 16 plus. But if you've not been contacted by your GP, I would urge you to contact them. I suspect if you're not a household member, but you do have regular daily contact, you may also be able to ask your GP if you could have priority vaccination. And I think it's worth having that conversation. I've directed people to the GP or to ring 119 to book. I don't think you can do it online via this priority group. So most people can expect some mild to moderate symptoms: a sore arm, headache, muscle aches, flu-like symptoms. You will have heard of vaccine-induced thrombosis and thrombocytopenia, VIT, which is what everyone's concerned about. And again, data yesterday suggested avoiding using the AstraZeneca vaccine in anyone under 40. It's an extremely rare reaction, usually to the first dose. It's an immune reaction rather than a clotting disorder. So if you've had blood clots before, it doesn't make you more prone to this. And it usually occurs in 5 to 28 days after the vaccine. It's been particularly seen in AstraZeneca, and I think the Janssen vaccine that will be available to us later this year. But possibly some similar things with other vaccines. And there's been around 200 cases in the UK. And as I say, there was an update yesterday, I don't believe because they feel the risk is higher, but because as COVID comes down and more vaccines are available, as we now have Moderna vaccine available, there are alternatives for the under 40s. And just to mention here of new variants, there are thousands of mutations over the last year, but these become of concern when they become more infectious or if they escape immunity, so thought to be less well covered by the vaccine. Now, pleasingly, most of the current vaccines suggest some protection over the variants, but it's likely that boosters over the next few years will help cover new variants as they emerge. Again, since I wrote this talk, the Indian mutation has now become a variant of concern. And I believe there's been about 500 cases in the UK, 50 clusters, and the Northwest as well as London are particular areas of concern. I don't know why particularly, but that is certainly something to keep an eye on. And again, this data is available on the internet for us all to monitor. I'll skip through those. There's just the numbers of those cases. So, how to stay safe as lockdown eases. For many of you, you've been shielding over this last year, and I know there's been a huge variety of how people have handled shielding for various reasons, and it's a very personal thing. But I'll talk about some general principles, and I know many of you will have had very little contact with the outside world over the last year, whereas others, whether for financial reasons or whatever, have had to take more risks than they necessarily wanted to do. So when weighing up how to come out of lockdown, I think it's an incredibly personal choice that needs to weigh up certain factors, your own medical risk, your own personal risk tolerance, as well as the circumstances involved. So when you have a medical risk, you look at how immunosuppressed you are, your ethnicity, if you have diabetes, heart disease, older age, and weigh these up versus perhaps if you're younger, you've got no other illnesses of concern, you've had 2 doses of vaccine. When you're looking at your personal risk tolerance, this is really how much risk you're prepared to take, and everybody is different. So if you look at this triangle and at the top, the red activities, maybe something like skydiving, bungee jumping, I would stay well away from those, and I would be much more happy with things in the green, walks in the park, and everybody will be different. Some people are risk takers, some people want minimum risk whatsoever and are well in the green, and that is very much your personal decision, and you should always go at your own pace with this. And then the circumstances involved. So people may have their own personal reasons for easing out of lockdown. I know people who've never seen or held their new grandchild. Some people financially have just had to come out of lockdown quicker than others because they're self-employed, because they can't work from home, because they haven't been offered furlough. And my heart goes out to everyone who's had really difficult decisions over the last year and missed so many things. And I think also weighing up your mental health of being isolated versus the anxiety of coming out of lockdown is really important. And again, as I've told my patients over the last year, being shielded for so long and not managing to exercise and get your heart racing like it perhaps would, rushing about over previous years, it's important to keep some cardiovascular fitness. And that is certainly a downside of shielding. So taking some regular exercise so that you're getting out of breath 3 times a week would be recommended. This is a risk chart that, again, has just been recently published to help guide you with some of the safer activities. And this is really based on what we know about how COVID is spread. So that droplet infection from being near within 1 to 2 meters of people, as well as the airborne ventilation. So just taking you through this, if you're wearing a mask and you're in an area that is outdoors or well ventilated, you should be able to undertake general conversation, even loud conversation or singing at minimal risk. But once you add in a poorly ventilated room or lots of people, high occupancy, that risk increases. So using your judgment in every situation is really important. And then, as I mentioned before, the time you spend, so a longer period of time in any of these areas increases the risk. And you may choose to stay mainly in the green. You may be more happy to take risks and enter some of those amber areas. But do bear in mind these red areas are higher risk. And then if you're not wearing a mask, many of these areas, the risk increases. So particularly now, not wearing a mask in a place for a long time of high occupancy, even being silent does have an increased risk. This is an American chart, but it just adds some details to some of those areas that I talked about. So things like getting a takeaway, going to fill up with petrol, going camping, going grocery shopping are pretty low risk. Playing golf, going for a walk or a bike ride, and those risks increase as you having dinner at someone's house, going to a barbecue outside, but it might be for a longer period of time, right down to going to a sports stadium, going to a religious service with over 500, going to a bar are higher risk activities. And obviously the risks of these activities increases with the increased prevalence of COVID at that particular time. So whereas right now, when cases are really nicely low, some of these activities here are probably quite acceptable. Once those cases increase, and I talked about back in October when in Manchester our cases were over 500 per 100,000, these activities would be worth avoiding. The eating in a restaurant, going to the hairdressers. And it's well recognised that people will be quite anxious when they come out of shielding and lockdowns. And it's important to recognise that and know that that's normal. And start with small challenges. I've advised people just to go to the end of their road, or even for some, just to the end of their path who have actually been in their house most of this year, and go at your own pace. And little and often is the way to do it. So small steps, small walks out of your house rather than all day at a park. Avoiding those red zones such as the Trafford Centre, and going more to the outdoors. Think about the things that you enjoyed doing before COVID and work towards getting back to doing those, and be aware of any catastrophic thoughts of, you know, someone passing you and are they going to give you COVID? And if you're feeling anxious when you're out and about, remember some mindfulness techniques such as the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise, which, if I remember, is notice 5 things that you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, and 1 that you can taste. Just helps bring you back to the moment. And it's important to talk to others about how you're feeling. This is an updated information sheet from the WHO based on this week's data, and it's just recapping some of those things that I've said. So it's better to be outdoors rather than indoors. It's better to be with a smaller number of people than a large number of people, and further away rather than close together, and a shorter period of time is better. So to summarise, we've gone through our knowledge of COVID, how it spreads, how to treat it, and how to protect against it. I do urge you to think about the local incidence of COVID, and as that reduces, the benefits of coming out of shielding increase, but do follow the data. Rather than the politics, I would say, as there's lots of good data out there. I personally will listen to Independent Sage, who give a briefing every week about data that's not confused with politics, to really help you make those important decisions. Vaccination is effective in people taking immunosuppression, probably not as much as the general population, but do have 2 doses, and do encourage everyone you're in contact with to get the vaccine. Choose greener activities, continue hands, face, space, and bear in mind time. And just be aware it won't be easy to come out of lockdown. Take time for your mental health. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was a very comprehensive overview of very, very, very pertinent topics. A lot of information which I wasn't aware of. So first thing I'm going to ask you is the COVID risk charts that you put up. That I think the American one I found especially useful in terms of, going out to dinner, going to a football match, etc. Where can people access those COVID risk charts?
They're out there on Twitter, particularly, has been a useful place to get that information. But I think if you Google COVID risk charts and images, they will come up. There's a Professor Greenhalgh is the one who put together the first one I showed. She's a UK professor in primary care, and they're actually translated into lots of different languages and they were coming through on Twitter in the last week or so. So there's many language specific versions.
Okay, that's incredibly helpful. I have a question from somebody who I think is a speech and language therapist in the NHS, who says, I've been shielding throughout without breaking, despite government suggesting it's okay to do so. What is the advice around returning to work-based stroke clinics, seeing patients face to face? I guess this is someone who's going to be working with, around the mouth, and
that's really difficult, particularly as a speech language therapist. I've got a number of patients who work in the healthcare profession, and it's been extremely difficult for them. The Renal Association did produce some guidance, but I couldn't see it on their website to include it in today's talk, looking at high-risk professions as well as your own risk factors. So do you have diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, obesity, different ethnic groups, to help compare your job versus your own personal risk? And I would really recommend speaking to your clinician about that, speaking to your occupational health about how you can safely go back to work based on your own personal risk factors.
Yeah, just to chip in, we do have similar people, maybe not people who've had transplants, but who are clinically extremely vulnerable, who we ask for guidance from occupational health, and they give us a bit of a stare as to what activities they can safely go back to, perhaps, part of the role, perhaps none of the role. But I'm just conscious that I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we had this issue with ENT surgeons, coming down with COVID. And we thought it was because of the amount of work they did around the mouth and the secretions there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's extremely difficult. There's no right answer. I think it has to be individualized. And at the moment, I can't quite get my head around speech therapy as to what would be the safest thing. But I think a discussion with your clinician would be what I would recommend. I've certainly had nurses who worked in our hospital that, you know, we've discussed other ways to work, people who regularly would take mouth swabs who are now doing a slightly different job back at work. So it's a discussion and a thoughtful discussion, weighing up people's priorities and risk.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, the area you cover, I guess Bolton is your patch.
Bolton's my dialysis patch, but transplants all of our Salford northwest. Yeah,
there's been some worrying news. Well, I don't know if it's worrying, but there's been some news about surge testing in Bolton because of a number of variants that have been detected in Bolton in the last week. Has that impacted your patients in any way at all? Any different advice or?
Not at this stage, and I think the surge testings are confined to quite local areas. Certainly, our dialysis unit, we've got clear protocols now on how to keep everyone protected coming to and from dialysis. My colleagues have done an awful lot of work on this, which to their credit has kept the risk to a minimum. So a little bit now it's become routine, I think, sadly, but just recommending to anyone if now that lateral flows are available, I think they can only add to our information. So having lateral flow tests yourself or those people around you, if you're coming into contact with them, helps protect you, as well as obviously the vaccine. And at this point in time, vaccination does seem to be protective to the variants in circulation.
Okay, that's reassuring. When the vaccines came out, there was some data that suggested, and I think was borne out, that significant vaccine hesitancy among especially the Black community. In your transplant and kidney disease patients, did you notice any particular vaccine hesitancy? I'm asking this because from those people who I interacted with, knowing that they were clinically extremely vulnerable, they seem to be a subset who were not hesitant at all to take the vaccine. But I don't know whether that applied more generally in the population you treat.
So in our transplant population, I'd entirely agree with you. The uptake of the vaccine's been phenomenal. So within a space of 3 or 4 weeks, either ourselves or in community, 95% of our population were vaccinated. And that's followed through with the second dose of vaccine. So our population really saw the importance of this. In the dialysis population, yes, I think there was some more reservation with our Black and ethnic minority population. But again, we manage the transplant ones often with discussion with our nursing team. So every patient had a phone call to discuss vaccination, and similarly in dialysis, a face-to-face discussion with a clinician. The uptake has been good, and I think sometimes it's just about that conversation.
Yeah, that's good to know. One thing that I wasn't aware of was that, going by what you said, every member of the household where there's someone who's been part of the shielding program is actually able to put themselves forward for a vaccination and has been for a while.
Yeah.
So the entire household of any transplant patient, any dialysis patient, and in fact, anybody who got a letter from the NHS saying you should be shielding. So I guess the thing is to encourage other people who might be thinking, well, I'm waiting for my turn, I'm 25, I'm 26, to go out and get vaccinated now because that is available.
absolutely. So anyone over the age of 16, so if you've got youngsters in college particularly, I would be urging them to contact a GP or ringing 119. And as I said, I think particularly if you had a carer who was coming in, or someone not an official carer, but someone who you would class as someone who helps care for you, I think it's worth having that conversation, even if they don't live with you. The more you're protected, the bigger your bubble of protection around you, the safer you will be.
Okay. Now, about June last year, when the antibody tests first became available, all hospital staff were offered antibody tests if you wanted them. I went for an antibody test hoping that I had antibodies, and I had COVID but I didn't have antibodies. When you do your trials for your dialysis and transplant patients for antibodies, do you collect that just as data for the study, or do you tell the patients that you had antibodies or you haven't had an antibody response? Do they know that data?
So yes, so currently we're taking those samples as part of clinical care. So we've been checking in our dialysis patients monthly, and that's helped us pick up if there's been any outbreaks at all. And then now we've been checking in our transplant patients each time they come for bloods. And again, certainly from myself, I discuss that with my patients when they attend a clinic or it's a telephone review quite often. But I mean, I do have caveats that we're still learning. If it's a negative antibody test, I can't say for sure it's a true negative. But I would still advise taking protective measures. Equally, if you do have antibodies, still take protective measures, but hopefully with just a little bit more reassurance there.
Yeah. What's your advice on, I guess this is very new, foreign travel? Clearly, the red list countries you can't go to. The green list countries you can go to, apparently, but there's the airport, there's the plane, and there's the closed ventilation in the aircraft, etc. What's your advice? Does that start in the triangle of risk? Is that now heading towards the red end?
Yeah, so if you look at that risk chart that I showed you, so being in an aeroplane with recirculating ventilation, with high occupancy, I think it's a risk. I don't know whether travel, if they're going to ask for a PCR test before you get on an aeroplane, that would reduce the risk. I don't know. I know obviously people coming into the country that it's been asked for. I don't think we've got that detail yet on what's going to be asked of holidaymakers, but that would go some way to reducing the risk. And then it comes down to your own personal attitude to risk, as well as as the circumstances, the desire you have for going abroad. If and everyone will have a different threshold. If it's to see family members or to lie in the sun after what's been a really difficult year, everyone will have their own priorities there. But it's a risk. It's a risk. I think it's also a risk that you could book somewhere now and it's moved from the green zone to the amber or the red zone by the time your holiday comes available. So, looking at the list that was announced yesterday of the 12 places, I think one place on there is uninhabitable. I know Australia and New Zealand wouldn't accept us anywhere anyway. So I think foreign travel remains difficult for many reasons.
Okay. So is it your expectation that anybody who is under your care as a renal patient now will know, in addition to what their blood tests are doing, if they're interested, they will also know whether or not they had antibodies at their last test? They will have that information.
They'll have that information based on a clinical discussion. But with all the caveats that I said, that we don't know clearly for certain what it means. Time will inform us. And just because you have antibodies now doesn't mean that you will have antibodies in 3 weeks' time when you choose to go to the busy wedding or whatever. So whilst it's there in the clinical informative world, I think really we're still using it to fully understand COVID rather than to use it to make clinical decisions.
Okay. From a clinical point of view, as a clinician, when COVID, I don't know if it will go away or we start to live with it, when life starts to get back towards normal, what would your recommendation be about visitors on a renal unit? Currently, most hospitals are not allowing visiting in except for exceptional circumstances. Some commentators have said, actually, these are one of the changes in COVID that will look like we might be adapting going forward. But I just wanted your view on that, whether, taking the balance, what would be your view about visitors coming back to a transplant unit or dialysis unit?
So this would be my own personal opinion that I think visitors are really important. They're part of your well-being, about dealing with a chronic disease, not just yourself, but with your family members. And if if that whole experience is better for you with a family member there, then hopefully one day we can get back to that. Certainly in hospital, to not have visitors and have some, it's often one of your most distressing times to have to do that on your own, I think is very hard. And I'd hate to think we'd got used to just having relatives at the end of the phone rather than face to face. So I would hope that's not a permanent fixture. But I think there's other things that have helped and been useful during this year. And one thing is telephone consultations, and where they don't work for everybody, they certainly work for people who are juggling work commitments that we can just speak on the phone. And maybe clinics will look different from now on, and hopefully more tailored. Some people come in face to face. Some people we just have face to face once a year, and the rest of the time a telephone catch up. I like having blood results prior to speaking to patients. It's something I've always wanted, and now we've got that. So there's been many positives, and we should keep those. But there's other things that I think it'd be nice to move away from.
In terms of the patients who are undergoing dialysis, so the hemodialysis patients the peritoneal dialysis tend to take care of themselves at home. A few of the hemodialysis are able to dialyze at home, but the vast majority come into the center. The frequency of dialysis, did you change that during COVID? Is it safe? Or because there's a risk of frequent attendance to hospitals versus not having your disease controlled. How did you manage that?
So we were one of the only units in the country that did reduce our dialysis to twice a week for some patients. And that was based on each patient having a clinical judgment. Would they manage on twice a week based on a number of biochemical factors, fluid balance, blood pressure, potassium, how well the toxins clear, whether they've got some residual kidney function. And we managed that for a short period of months in that first peak, which enabled us to redesign our dialysis units to cope with patients with COVID-19, as we were still learning how best to manage that. And they were safe during that time, and we've published on that. It's not a long-term strategy, and that reduced dialysis, for some who can manage with that, for very specific small number of people, we've still got on twice a week, but the majority are back on 3 times a week now.
Okay. And just one final question, Rachel. Should all patients with chronic kidney disease now have lateral flow tests at home? Because I know that I think it was expanded that anybody who wanted one could access them. I'm not sure how they access them, but should all kidney disease patients be having lateral flow tests at home?
I wouldn't say everyone should, but I think for some it can be useful. Thinking about those 33 patients who had COVID without knowing it, if they or their family members had lateral flows, it could have perhaps prevented them having infection. And certainly for those people who developed severe symptoms and some that sadly died, if people around them were testing, or they were testing and finding out earlier that they had COVID, I don't think there's any studies to back me up here, but it stands to reason the earlier you know about it, the quicker you can be monitored and changes to your immunosuppression if needs be, and hopefully keep you safer. So I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to do at all. No, absolutely. However, if you're in the house and really not coming into contact with people and only having walks in the park, it's probably, or could, add to your anxiety rather than not. And most patients are aware of where they are on that anxiety-provoking spectrum, I would say. So I think most patients would know themselves whether they'd find that useful or not.
Right. Thank you very much, Rachel. It's been a fascinating session, and I must say your passion for the field and also your care for the patient just comes through once you get into the meat of the matter, as it were. I'm going to round up, and just to remind people of what you've told us today, that we found out that in addition to the droplet transmission, aerosol transmission is actually quite important. And the way to get around that is by adequate ventilation where you can. And as we're getting towards the summer now, it's probably easier to be in a well-ventilated space. If you do come down with COVID-19, there is the option of applying for a pulse oximeter at home where you can monitor your oxygen concentrations, and you'll have backup from the hospital as well through telephone calls. So that's something to bear in mind if you're not unwell enough to be admitted to hospital. Lateral flow testing is available. Consider it if you think you would benefit from it. If you live in a house with many other people who are in and out and are not shielding. Shielding worked very well. The data backs it up. And especially when you have rising infection rates and our numbers rising, which the government will tell us on a weekly basis, shielding proved very, very helpful and did reduce the number of infections. Vaccination is also very important, but also household vaccination, vaccinating all members of your household. And I think we should all take advantage of that. Actually, I wasn't aware of this, and I will certainly go on and vaccinate all the members of the household now. When shielding has finished and we're coming out of lockdown, possibly still continue using a mask, because it does help, especially if you're clinically extremely vulnerable. Be aware of social distancing. Try and get out for regular exercise so you keep your body ticking over and you don't suffer secondary problems from deconditioning. And do what feels safe for you, because everyone has a different attitude to risk. My last advice would be to go onto the internet and type in COVID risk chart. And just take a look at the various activities. It will tell you which is of a higher risk and a lower risk, and that may tailor your the way you go back into society. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, Rachel. I don't know if you have any final words before I hand over to Hilary to close the session.
No, nothing else to say. I think that was an excellent summary. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very Thank you very much, Rachel and Theo, for an interesting conversation this evening. I've learned a lot today, and I hope that everybody who has come has actually done the same. And they feel better about it. As I said at the beginning, I have something exciting I'm sure everybody attending today would like to get involved in. Last year, May on the 20th, a new law was introduced for organ donation. The law was introduced to ensure that people on the transplant list had a better chance of a transplant and a second chance at life. The new law was called Organ Donation Law, or as it's popularly known, Max and Kira Law. With its introduction, everybody over 18 was regarded as having given consent for their organs to be used when they die. However, this isn't an automatic decision. Families have to give consent before any organs from their relatives can be used. Unfortunately, organ donation is an issue that most people do not discuss, especially in the Black community, for many reasons. For more details, people can go to the website organdonation.nhs.uk or our website wshbmenetwork.org.uk. To celebrate the first anniversary, we at Wish BME Kidney Network and Long for Life have decided to do a challenge. Please watch this video.
Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana.
So what we are hoping to do is, if you're interested, shoot a video, upload it to all your social media platforms using the hashtag #KeepThemCertain by the 19th of May for a retweet, share, and mention from us, and tag at NHS Organ Donor and at Wish BME Network and at Michelle's Lungs for Life. We want to continue the conversation around organ donation. So we'll be sending out adverts in the next few days. So everybody, if you're on today and you think that, this is something that you would want to be involved in, we would ask you to start shooting, get shooting, learn those steps. It is the Jerusalem dance step. We'll be sending out videos and everything to everybody across all our social media platforms. We'd love to see what you can do. It's going to be fun. I know it's going to be. And I want to see people talking about organ donation and how we can continue to raise awareness around organ donation and the number of people who need that second chance at life. So thank you for coming today. And I hope to see you in the next 2 weeks on another session. And all the information will be going out to everybody during the next few weeks. So thank you very much for coming out, and I hope to see you at the next session. Thank you. And thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you, Theo, for moderating the session. Bye, everybody, and see you next time.